of if you go into the field of apologetics, which is a very vast field, just like science, there is so many ways to approach it. But you have two ways to understand apologetics. First, you have the foundational idea, which is the philosophy of apologetics, right? And then you have what you could say the doing of apologetics. So you have people that will learn and use apologetics, and then you have other people that will develop arguments for apologetics, right? So let's say we can talk about one of the most famous arguments for God's existence, which is the cosmological argument, which bases its idea on the fact that the universe had a beginning, therefore it requires a cause, right? Anything that exists and that is not eternal requires a cause. That's the principle in philosophy of causality. Now, when you take this argument, cosmological argument, I'm using it, we're using it, you guys are using it, but we did not develop the arguments, right? We're just using an argument developed by somebody else. Now, by doing apologetics, we're just using the arguments. By doing the philosophy apologetic, which we should do, is we are deciding which arguments are working for us, which argument we find biblical to use. Let me give you an example. Do you think that people today are bothered by the content of the Bible? They are, right? There's many things in the Bible people find completely unacceptable in today's society. For example, what they believe is the role of woman in the Bible, it's against feminism today. Or the idea that two people who are the same sex cannot marry because the Bible says it's sin, then they don't agree with it. So then we understand, because we believe what the Bible is, our approach and our answer to those questions may be different depending on what we believe the Bible is. If I believe the Bible is a book, then I could distance myself from Paul and say, well, Paul said what he said because it was 20 centuries ago. I am sure that if Paul was here today, he would think differently. Is that an argument? It is an argument, but it would be unacceptable for those like us who believe the Bible is inspired, right? So, in defending the Bible, I would be doing two things depending on my philosophy of what the Bible is. If I believe the Bible is inspired and the Bible is the Word of God, I would not distance myself from Paul by saying, well, if Paul was here today, he would think differently. Sorry about the guy. Let's cancel him and we move on, right? So I'm going to read some other passage in the scriptures, like Jesus is love and all these things that people will find very attractive in the gospel. So that would be one way of defending my faith, by distancing myself from the scriptures. You can do that if you don't believe the Bible is inspired. But if you do believe as a philosophy that the Bible is inspired, then you will change your arguments. And you will try to prove, like other people have, like for example, that Paul did write against homosexuality in Romans 1, for example, but he did write in an era where homosexuality was way more common than it is today. People will say Paul said what he said because it was the mainstream idea that being homosexual was bad. No, the mainstream idea in Paul's time is that homosexuality was cool. And most high-ranking people, a higher society, were bisexual. They had a wife and a husband, but they had extramarital affair with the same sex. That was very common at the time. So when Paul said what he said, it was counterculture, just like he would today be counterculture. Okay? So I'm all saying this because this is what apologetics, it's kind of beside the point a little bit, but I like to give you some info for your bonus questions. So we do apologetics, or we use apologetics, right? We over here, and then you have philosophical basic ideas that will defend a way of doing apologetics. So, like as a Christian myself, Philippe Siraji, I believe the Bible is inspired, and therefore it is without error. So I cannot distance myself from Paul by saying, well, it's Paul's idea, I don't agree with it. I can't. So I will choose an approach, I will choose an argument based on what I believe to be true. That's why we've been discussing the last few weeks on the idea of what is a biblical approach to apologetics. Therefore, when we say, for example, Romans 1:18, we'll talk about it tonight. If Romans 1:18 says that they know the truth but they suppress it, how does that affect my use of arguments? It should affect my use of arguments. Because if they already know the truth and they suppress it, no amount of evidence will change that. And if it's true, then I should favor the preaching of the gospel and not favor the use of arguments. All right? Now we're getting to the point. Is what's the difference between evidential and presuppositional apologetics? The difference is down here in the philosophy. It's two different understanding of what apologetics should be accomplishing. Right? So I'm gonna swip. Can I have something to wipe this? I could use my sweater, but I don't think my wife would be happy about that. Okay, so now we're talking about a philosophy, right? You have the doing apologetics, and most people don't really think about, when they learn apologetics, they don't really think about what really their apologetic is accomplishing or not, right? But then when you want to be a biblical Christian, and when you want to develop a biblical approach, a theologically sound approach to apologetics, you have to think about what philosophy you want to use. So the evidentialist approach, which as the name indicates, he's based on the heavy use of evidence, right? Thank you. It's based on the heavy use of arguments and evidence. Now, the point being, it's not bad at all. It's just one way of doing it that I do not really especially recommend, because, and we'll talk about this later on tonight when we'll discuss about the role of reason in conversation, especially when it comes down to the gospel. An evidentialist approach will think that the efficiency of apologetics is based on the proper use of evidence solely, right? So, as the name indicates, evidentialism is based on evidence. And you would think the more evidence I'm giving you, the more convincing you will be. That's the idea, right? So, most of the modern apologists, you would say, tend to be evidentialists. I don't know if you've heard of Josh McDowell. He's an evidentialist from the 1960s and 70s. His son, Sean McDowell, today, gearing more to young people. They're both very much evidentialists. Yes, sir. Can I ask a question? You can ask a question.
So I have this thought. Oh, thank you.
Okay.
I want to ask a question.
Yes.
When the apostles, this is a big thing on us because we're teaching Acts.
Yes.
In Acts chapter 6, when the apostles create the deacon position, and they say that they need to spend more time in the Word, weren't they creating an evidentiary apologetic when they were studying to be able to prove to people that Jesus was indeed the Messiah from the Old Testament?
Okay.
Did you feel that's what they were doing?
No.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
Can you security, let's get this guy out of here.
Can I tell you why?
Yeah.
Okay, because they were using the Old Testament, which is scriptures,
right,
to prove how he accomplished the scriptures.
But isn't that apologetic?
That is using the scriptures for apologetics. That wouldn't be evidentialist.
That's not evidentialist.
No, the evidentialist would not use scriptures. He would use other evidence.
Okay.
Like if you read, for example, Josh McDowell's book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, it will be hard for you to find a verse besides the fact that he accomplished the promises from the Old Testament. So
that's the one I'm thinking.
But he did one that, and then the vast majority will be how the text was transmitted, how it makes sense for us to believe because of the seal and the way the Romans did. So he used a lot of historical background, cultural background, archaeological background to prove the Bible to be true.
So then scriptural apologetics about Christ is not evidential?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Because the idea would be, like, for example, okay, I like the conversation, actually. It's funny. Because, okay, so let's put it this way. We're going to divide the two approach, right? We're going to put here evidentialists. I'm going to put EV, and then the other one is presupposition. We're going to call it pre, right?
Right.
So if I believe the Bible to be true, then my presupposition is the Bible is true. And I stop with that. I don't have to defend the scriptures. I just start with scripture. If you don't agree, we can talk about it. But as a presupposition, I start with what I believe. God exists, the Bible is true, and I start from there. An evidentialist will assume that since you don't believe the Bible is true, I have to prove it to you. So he will use archaeology, It will use all these things by saying, now that I'm using all these evidence, you're going to agree with me.
Yes.
So two different approach. One is I'm starting from presuppositions, hence the name. The other one, I'm not starting with my presuppositions. I want you to join me in my beliefs by proving to you that I'm right.
Okay, so presupposition apologetics is using the scriptures.
Is using the scriptures as a starting point.
So that's the type of apologetic that they were developing in that sense. Because that's why Paul was able to so quickly figure it out, because number one, the Holy Spirit. Number two, he knew the scriptures.
Yes.
Number three, they just needed to point them out.
Correct.
Okay. All right.
So now in evidence...
I'll let you finish.
Yeah, okay. So in evidentialism, again, what we'll be discussing later tonight is the use and place of evidence in apologetics. Now, there's plenty of room for it, but there's plenty of room in the proper way, which is answering questions as we preach the gospel, not a substitute for preaching the gospel. Now, the other issue we'll discuss that a little later. Now, so have you heard about the term rationalism? What do you think is rationalism? Not reasoning, not rationalizing, but rationalism. What is rationalism? What do you think it is? Anybody can tell me what you think. You can be wrong, it's fine. Over here.
Based on logic, when you say?
No.
Rationalism.
Okay, reasoning is based on logic,
okay,
but I'm asking the question rationalism. Rationalism. So rationalism is the philosophy that believes that reason is the ultimate authority for everything. Right? It's a philosophy. So rationalism is not a mechanism. Reasoning, as you said, using logic is a mechanism. But believing that my rational mechanism is the ultimate authority is rationalism. Just like I would, somebody like, for me, I believe in Christianity, I believe in the Bible, and then they don't, therefore they don't believe in miracle because they find miracles impossible, right? Anybody who you meet that don't believe in miracles will tell you that they don't accept miracles because they're impossible. By making this statement, they are telling you that their reason is the ultimate authority to decide if something is possible or not. Okay? That is rationalism. Meaning that I don't care how many proof you bring, I know what is true and what is not based on my own reasoning. So, if I use evidence in my apologetics, only evidence, never the preaching of the gospel, I'm actually making legitimate the idea that they are the ones to approve whether or not my beliefs are reasonable or not. But this is not the role of apologetics. Okay, so if someone believes that rationalism is the way, and they only are telling you, okay, bring me, like you come to me, okay, you bring me the gospel, you talk to me, and then you only use evidence. By this, you're showing to me that you agree with me that I will decide under my own ultimate authority whether I agree with you or not, right? The only way that someone can be transformed in their mind or challenged really in their mind and convicted, as we said in John 16:8, is the Holy Spirit. It's not the evidence. The evidence will clear the way for a conversation, but they cannot replace the strength and the power of the Holy Spirit. Now, if someone believes that they are supposed to be the judge of what is possible or is impossible, then you will find yourself in this place, which is you will be doing evidentialism, but you will not be able to have a gospel conversation, right? Because somebody says, well, I don't believe the Bible, is true. Well, the Bible is true because, and you go on and on and on, and you can quote 300 pages from Josh McDowell saying, well, these are all the reasons why, for example, the Masoretes copied they were scribes, and they copied the manuscript that we did find in 1948 in the Dead Sea Scroll, as we call the Dead Sea Scroll in Qumran. They have 18 golden rules, and among these rules, and you go on through that's why we believe that the text we have today is the same we had at the time, because those rules. And the guy says, okay, fine, but I don't believe in miracles. So they were efficient in copying myth. And all of a sudden you kind of got well, yeah, I know what you're saying, but then you know what I'm saying? So I proved to you that the texts we have today are the same as 2,000 years ago, but then you will reject it because you don't believe what it says. So by using only evidence and being a pure evidentialist. You don't challenge them with the truth of the Bible. You just told them that the myths have been transferred over the centuries properly. That's all you said. So if someone does not believe in miracles, it's not because you prove to them that the text has been transmitted properly that you prove to them that miracles are possible. You just showed them that yes, we have the same text that was written by Isaiah at the time. Yes, okay, we can see if you look at into the Dead Sea Scrolls, you'll be amazed on how many discoveries we made on how reliable the texts are, right? So we know for sure that the text we have of Isaiah, for example, that we found during the discoveries of Dead Sea Scrolls, we found manuscript that was 600 years older than the one we had before the discovery. And when we compared both of them, they were amazingly the same. And the difference was spelling, right? Nothing major, no change of sense, no change of scenery, everything is the same. But if you use that, what you've proven is, over the years, dedicated people transmitted the text properly. But you have not defended the content of what they said. You've just shown that they were capable of making copies. That's all you've proven. So if you want to accomplish a significance advance in preaching the gospel, you have to preach the gospel and you have to use evidence as a way to answer questions that rise up. But if I pile up evidence, all I will do is, number one, is render legitimate people's philosophy, thinking that they are the one deciding whether it's acceptable or not. And number two, you will prove not what you think you will prove something that they will be able to reject. Right? If we have, for example, think about you've heard of Homer, right? The famous Greek ancient writer. He wrote the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Ulysses stories, all these things. So we have very little manuscript of those things. We have actually very little proof that Homer really existed. We don't know who he was. So, but then if we were to one day, surprisingly, actually, it's the same for Shakespeare, which is the 16th century writer. We have the same issues. But, so we have, I think it's about 12,000 copies of ancient manuscripts of the New Testament that have been discovered over the years that are amazingly similar. So this is the most accepted idea that the New Testament has been transferred and transmitted over the centuries in a perfect manner. But the point is, Jesus walked on water. And somebody does not believe that Jesus can walk on water, what you have is a well-transmitted novel, a well-transmitted myth, just like we had the Iliad and Odyssey. Nobody believes that Ulysses actually lived and went on a tour for 30 years or something and fought against the gods of ancient Greece. Nobody believes that because it was written to be a novel. So what they will see is, the Bible is a great book. I can see what you're saying, but I don't believe anything in there. So you have not really made any progress in the conversation. What you've shown is that with all this evidence is that the Bible is reliable, it's been transmitted properly, and for centuries we actually can go back in time and realize, yes, these are the texts that were originally written, but nobody believed that Jesus walked on water. Somebody made it up on the first day, and it transmitted it over the centuries, and that's it. How do you go from using all this evidence, proving the Bible to be reliable, to not discussing whether or not Jesus walked on water? You find yourself in the place, now you're in a swamp, because what do you do? So when we start with evidence, we find ourselves in the place where we have to pile more evidence to get out of our own mess. If we go back to the presuppositional approach, meaning, okay, I'm going to start the conversation by preaching the gospel, as we said many, many times in the class. And then when I will be done, you remember 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18 and 19? The preaching of the cross is foolishness for those who perish, but for us, it is the power of God. And then he says, verse 19, he says, I will render void the intelligence of the intelligence and the wisdom of the wise. So God is saying, if you preach the gospel, I will take care of that wisdom from below, meaning I will do the work of the apologist. So the main difference, I want to finish this because I like to move on to the class. So the main difference here is not that one is better than the other in terms of content, is one assumes without knowing that rationalism is acceptable and the other one doesn't. That's my belief. So I'm sure if you read R.C. Sproul, for example, he's very much an evidentialist. I mean, he was because he passed, but he actually wrote articles and books against presuppositionalism. And that was my dissertation when I did my PhD research, was about the difference in the two. So it's a topic I know really well. So I know the arguments on both sides, but the point is, when you boil down to the best way to approach apologetics is to give room for the gospel and use evidence as a tool and never as the substitute for the preaching of the gospel. Okay, so that's the main difference, and I hope that will help you. Yes, sir. Can we have the mic? Yes. Thank you.
Philosophers, and I believe one example is Aldous Huxley, and I think he lived in the 19th century. In the Elizabethan, in the Victorian era. And he admitted in writing that he and his fellows thought that Victorian society was too tight-laced. And so they emphasized this, God doesn't exist type of philosophy, or everything came from the Big Bang, or other things like that. So what is the argument for there? Because I've heard, there were people that said the book of Daniel was written 300 AD, when actually the Dead Sea Scrolls showed that it had been written at least before 300 BC or so. And did the people that espoused the 300 AD theory say, oh, okay, yes, now the Dead Sea Scrolls prove it and I accept it. But is there an underlying behavioral motivation that keeps them believing what they think is the truth when it's actually the lie?
Yes. So as Christians, we have presuppositions. Okay, like I can argue for the existence of God, but I cannot prove the existence of God. Okay, because if I would be able to prove the existence of God, that would make the God I proved the God I made. Okay, because by the definition, I cannot completely prove the existence of God because of the nature of who He is. For the only way for us to know that God is true, He has to reveal Himself. So that's why we believe in the conviction of the Holy Spirit, because I can prove that I can easily prove to you scientifically and philosophically that the universe had a beginning. Very easy. And then someone who does not want to believe in God will argue that the cause could be anything else. Okay, and the conversation is endless. Well, how about it was the Muslim God? Or how was the several gods that were created from, and then now we have the multiverse theory. This universe comes from another universe that comes from another universe, and then you have it. Okay, so the point here, every time I prove something, if I submit it for approval to somebody else's reasoning, then I find myself in providing more evidence, and that's the circle. So, just as we as Christians have presuppositions, everybody who has a philosophy has, whether they know it or not, they have presuppositions. Okay, and some of them actually. So maybe later in the semester, if I think I'm coming another couple times, so I'm not sure, but how we could go like pre-commitment. Anyway, so for example, I read an article maybe 20 years ago by Richard Lewontin, who is a very famous biologist, and he was actually writing a book review about the last book that Carl Sagan wrote before he died. Okay, and it was on the philosophy of science. And it's interesting because there was one sentence that came out of the article that really was interesting to me, that shows some kind of pre-commitment. And he said that basically he was trying to explain that in our philosophy of science, we cannot accept to relinquish our commitment, which was for him was materialism, which is that there is nothing beyond matter and energy. Otherwise, we would let, and that's his exact sentence, we will let a divine foot in the door. Okay? So the point being is that if we let any chance that our presuppositions here are being challenged, then we will find ourselves in accepting the idea that God is possible, and we can't do that. Okay? So if you want the exact quote, I have it somewhere in my phone, I'm sure. But it's amazing because he's actually using the sentence, a divine foot in the door. We cannot allow that. Okay? So, and even in his article, it says, despite the crazy construct of science, and sometimes it is undefendable, we have to accept this, or the alternative will be religious, and we don't want that. So to answer your questions, do people have commitments? Yes, they have what we call prior commitments, right? And Richard Lewontin would be materialism. Therefore, he does not believe that anything beyond matter and energy exists. Therefore, we will have to reject any propositions that we bring. So when someone discovered or learned about the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, did they change their view on Daniel or Isaiah? Yes, they did, because they had to. Now we actually had manuscripts from the Old Testament that dated 400 or 500 years after AD. Okay, so it's sorry. So, what did they have to accept? They had to accept that the manuscripts that they had and the manuscripts they found were centuries apart. So now we go back. We thought that these manuscripts obviously was not reliable because the manuscript of Daniel, let's say a book, was 380, and Daniel was about maybe 300, 400 BC. So the 700-year gap between the supposed time of Daniel and the book of Daniel. Obviously, he didn't write it. Now, we find a manuscript that go back 400 years, and it's the same. There's no difference. So you have to change your view, but the only thing you have to change is that, oh, I was wrong. It was not written here. It was written here. So maybe some guy somewhere called Daniel wrote it. Does it change what I believe about the content? Not at all. Because I already believe that there's no such thing as dreams and gods and everything. Therefore, I don't believe that there are three guys enter into a furnace and came out of it. I don't believe that. So whether it was written over here or whether it is written over here, if I don't believe that three guys enter into a furnace and came out alive, I won't believe it in any way, right? So the point here is that when I pile up evidence, what I'm proving is, no, this text was actually written when it was supposed to, but you have not proven the truth of the content of the text. That is why it's very important for us to, and I believe that really strongly. I'm going to start with what the Bible says. What does the Bible says about itself? 1 Corinthians 1:18 again. The preaching of the cross is a foolishness for them, but for me, I believe it's the power of God. Therefore, if I presume, or I have if I have the presuppositions that the Bible is true and it's powerful, then I will be where I start. So, like, for example, I remember I had a conversation with a friend one day. He's not a believer. Someone I used to work with years ago. And we spoke about, and then I remember changing my conversation with him by saying, okay, now, and I use the sentence a lot, like, for the sake of the argument, let's believe that, let's say for the sake of the argument that God does exist. And I tell him, like, for example, this is atheism, God does not exist, and this is theism, and God does exist. And I put a few, like, on the paper, I wrote down a few words, and some of those words were actually very, like, hope and meaning and, significance, all these things, and over here. And I'm asking which one of those two philosophies makes more sense. I'm asking whether there is a God or there is no God. So, for the sake of the argument that says, let's believe that God exists, and do you think that if God does exist, does it change the way we see our lives? Why? Yeah, for example, do miracles become possible if there is a God? Yeah, of course, if there is a God, So, and then he starts to see, and it's the first time I actually made the switch in this conversation. Sorry, that's why I remember it, and realized, well, hold on for a second. When I pile up evidence, he argues for all of it. When I ask him which ones make more sense by presenting the gospel the way it is, he was more tempted to argue, to agree with me in the gospel and what it meant, than to agree with me when I argued with him. It was so interesting for me to see that. And I realized, well, because if you present the gospel for what it is, it's really coherent. It makes sense. Well, the universe had a beginning, there has to be one, so obviously it has to be more powerful than, and it has to be what the philosophers call transcendent, not contingent. It's not wrapped up in the universe. And then it means power, it means intelligence because the world is organized. It has to be some moral aspect to it because obviously we have morals, and that can be explained by strictly by evolution. And I also realized, well, none of this world's philosophy, that is atheism, makes sense in the real world. Like G.K. Chesterton, that I quoted a few times, he said basically, gradually materialism destroys humanity. That's what he says. Gradually, materialism destroys humanity, because he says materialism, which believed, again, that there is nothing but matter and energy, does not explain the reality of man, and does not explain the reality of human experience. So Chesterton asked the question, for example, how about courage? How do you explain courage? How do you explain emotions? None of those things that makes us human make any sense in an evolutionary model. Because none of what we have as human beings are advantages to survive in an evolutionary model. It does not. None of what we have, like our interest for museums and aesthetic and beauty and art, how are they an advantage for evolution? What are they useful for? People say, well, we need the brain we have to survive. Give me one other species that survived over billions of years, according to your model, that doesn't have a brain and is still here today. Bacteria. Bacteria don't have a cognitive system. They don't have museums. They don't have universities. They don't need to be trained to be bacteria. That's what they are. So the guys were there at the beginning. They have not evolved in billions of years, and they are better suited in this world than you and I today. So then you start to realize this worldview over here that I presuppose in my presenting of the gospel makes a lot more sense than this one that excludes everything that we believe to be true. And we say in apologetics that when someone is not a Christian but believe that life is meaningful, has to borrow from Christian principles. Otherwise, they wouldn't be surviving. Like I read this book by Richard Dawkins. I think I quoted the Dawkins every time. He's a biologist, a philosopher. Oh, I would be rude tonight by saying a wannabe philosopher, but he's a biologist. He's an atheist. And basically, you can summarize his philosophy by a very simple sentence. All the horrific things we see in the world can be explained by the one specific sentence that he used in one of his books. It must be so. Why? Because if evolution is true, evil is meant to be a way that evolution will use for natural selection. That's the way it is. But why? If you and I are product of evolution, only why do we care about evil in the world? It doesn't make any sense. If you and I were not programmed for anything, we don't care. We don't even. Why do we seek for meaning? Because you and I should be there for the survival of the species. But we don't. If somebody gave them my property and says, get on my property, this is mine. Everything is about me. All this individualism we see in the 21st century is contrary to anything you would expect on an evolutionary model. None of these things make sense at all. And the thing is, remember what we said at the beginning of the semester? One aspect of apologetics is challenging, right? I'm going to someone, I'm challenging their philosophy. Evidentialism never does that. It can't, because evidentialism is trapped in the idea that I have to defend my viewpoint. And I don't think it's a viable or actually a useful method just to be in a corner somewhere and trying to defend myself. I don't know if any of you did fighting sports. I did fighting sports for 15 years. And when I did that, there's one thing you need to know is the one place you don't want to be is in a corner. You don't want to be in a corner because the only thing you can do is protect yourself. And then there's two things that can knock you out, right? It's your liver and your head. But you cannot protect both in a corner. You can't because you can move. Right? In defense, for those who did boxing, for example, in defense, there's the better way of defending yourself is moving, right? You're moving all the time. So if somebody, so you're protecting one side and the other one is you're moving. But it's the same thing with apologetics. If I find myself in a corner and I'm restricted in defending what I believe, I don't have any chance to challenge my friend who I'm talking to. This is why I believe the presuppositional approach is the best. Because it's more complete, right? You have questions? Can you give him the mic? Thank you, Jose.
So can we simplify the point you're making now that the evidentiary approach is similar to the concept you talked about of arguing on the basis of human intelligence or intellect, while the presuppositional approach is bringing in a higher form of intelligence, which is that of God, that is higher than man, and so that always will triumph over the argument of man?
It's very good. The way you're saying is very good. And actually, remember, were you there when we studied the 1 Corinthians 1?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
you remember at the end what God says, like in the God's foolishness is higher than man's wisdom. That is the point we're making. Now, again, we're going to be discussing tonight the other place. So my assignment is I have not started the assignment yet. I just realized, remember you text me thinking we have a lot of assignments to do, which one of them is the psychology of the unbeliever. And then we'll talk about faith, reason, and evidence in their use. So we're kind of doing this in the same time. But the point being here is that the place of reason in apologetics and the place of evidence will depend on where you stand in your philosophy. Like if I believe that God is capable of touching a heart without me using evidence, I have a better start than if I don't believe that, right? Because I will be starting with the gospel. Now, the thing is, and we'll be discussing the role and the nature of faith in the conversations. Someone to be saved they have to have faith. They cannot be, if you convince someone purely on the intellectual level, what you're doing is you are making a disciple of your thinking. You're not being, this is not conversion. Conversion is spiritual. It's faith. The faith is required for someone to be saved. But then the point being here is that if I don't preach the gospel, there is no faith that people can cling on, right? And what you did is you may have converted someone intellectually, and that's why we have people. If you ask someone, what do you know about Jesus? Jesus is an amazing guy. He's a great dude. Look at him. He's so peace and love. Give the other cheek. So people do like that. If everybody was like Jesus, there wouldn't be any war in this world. So they love the philosophy, and it's very appealing. But Jesus also said things that people don't want to hear. These are the things that they need to hear in order to be saved. Like, you're a sinner. I'm not like Adolf Hitler. No, you're not. But you still are a sinner. So the point being here is that if I want to put all the chances on my side, I have to use the most powerful tool that I have at my disposal, which is the preaching of the cross. But then we'll do, when we'll start discussing the role of faith and reason and evidence, like in detail, you realize that I'm going to say something about faith, and then that will just segue to what I want to say tonight. Okay, so can any of you can give me a definition of faith, right? And Jose will walk around with the microphone. What do you think? Not a definition, but you could be a definition or an example of what faith is. Trust. Okay. Thank you, Pastor. Who else?
Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not yet seen from the Word.
Hebrews 11:1. Yes. Okay. So we'll talk about that because this is very important. Okay. Who else? There's no wrong answer. I mean, there is, but I won't point it out. I will be nice. Over here.
Rephrasing that verse, believing beyond just what you see.
Okay. Believing about what you see. Okay, very good. So I'm going to commend you guys because it's for one of the very rare time when I don't get those answers. Sometimes I'm thinking, okay, I don't think we have a good understanding of faith. For most people, faith is unreasonable. That's the idea. Faith is the thing you shouldn't be doing, but you have to do it because God said so. So, and that sounds like, for most people, it's, cool, what faith? What? Faith is like, this is a cliff, I'm going to jump and believe in God. This is not faith. But the problem is, many Christians believe this is faith, and many unbelievers believe this is faith. So when they tell you your faith is nuts, they actually are vindicated because many times our faith is nuts. But what we're discussing here, and thank you for quoting Hebrews 11:1 here. Let's go to Hebrews 11:1. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for and evidence of things not seen. The words that are used here are very rare in the New Testament. You don't find them a lot. You find them 4 times for one and 2 times for the other one. Okay, but think about those words that, like, we have the word substance and the word evidence. Is that amazing? Would you, when you hear people speak about faith, would the word evidence come to mind? Not at all. Nah, no. And you know what? Did I quote Mark Twain? I think I did. So Mark Twain said about faith, which reflects what most people think about it, and which actually reflects what most unbelievers think about it. Mark Twain said, faith is believing something you know is not true. That's what it means. Faith is believing something you know it's not true. Mark Twain. Mark Twain. Yes. Obviously, Mark Twain was not a believer. Apparently, he wasn't. He was not a Christian, of course. But the point is, I know some Christians would agree with it. Well, like the Bible says, he called things that are not like if they are. This is not what it means. Faith in the Bible is, and Pastor Shibli said it well, is trust. Let's think about, Genesis 12, Genesis 15, when Abraham is called to, by God, he has a promise, and then he's supposed to, offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice. Now, if you heard, I don't know if you heard of Søren Kierkegaard. Søren Kierkegaard is a famous Danish philosopher. He was a Christian, but a Christian existentialist Christian philosopher, which is a whole different realm. We don't have time for this. But his point was, as any Christian and non-Christian existentialist would think, is that you have sometimes the duty to distance yourself from your faith, because your faith will make you do things that are crazy. And the one example he gives is Abraham. He thinks, and that's what he calls the jump into the void, or the jump into the faith. And this is how we could say it. For most people, where is the? Okay. All right. It seems that I'm all over the place tonight, but I'm saying one thing differently. So bear with me. So. This is what most people will review faith, right? So this is your reason over here, and this is faith. And in between, there's a huge gap, which some people would call common sense, right? So this is you and I over here. Do we offer our children for a sacrifice? We don't, because you don't do that. You're crazy, right? Why would you do this? If you would do this in the name of God, I would call social services on you, even though I believe in God. You're nuts. You shouldn't do this. But did Abraham did it? Did he do it? Yeah. So this is the gap here that you should not cross, according to Søren Kierkegaard. So he goes, you jump over here, you end up here, and then you're offering your son because you live by faith. And there is absolutely no connection between faith and reason. That's what Søren Kierkegaard and others would tell you. Now, when you look at this, you might agree with this diagram. Well, yeah, of course. Sometimes I do things that don't make really sense. I go beyond my reason. But going beyond your reason does not mean you go against it. Right? One way I like to phrase faith for me when it comes to apologetic, I'm saying very simply that faith is a different way of reasoning. Very simple. Faith is a different way of reasoning. What do I mean by that? I mean by, if God is true, and I believe he is, it will change the way I believe things. Obviously. Think about Peter when he was on the boat and Jesus walks on water. Remember? Jesus walks on water and they're all afraid. And he says, be not afraid, it's me. You remember what Peter said before he walked on water? You remember exactly what he said? Yes. He says, if it is you, bid me to come. Well, he didn't say, well, hi, Jesus, I'm coming your way. He didn't say that. Why didn't he say that? Why didn't Peter say, oh, it's you, I'm coming? He could have said that. He didn't. Why do you think he didn't say that? Why did he say to Jesus, bid me to come? That would have been his jump. Faith is obeying a word from God. Faith is not presumption, right? So Peter knew this much. If it is you, you tell me to come, it becomes possible for me to walk on water. If you don't tell me to come and I join you, I would not be able to walk on water. So you see, when Peter is on the boat, he's using his reason. Who walks on water? No one. Jesus does, but everybody knows who he is, right? Peter knows who Jesus is. Of course he knows. Otherwise he wouldn't follow him. He's not following some cool guy. He knows exactly who Jesus is. So does it make sense for Jesus to walk on water? Yeah, he could walk on water. He could swim. He could reach the bottom of the Marian Trench and grab a pebble from there and bring it back up. He can. He could go back to Mars, grab some sand over there, bring it back in a second. He can, because he's God. He could do whatever he wants. But can I? Peter asked. No, I can't, unless you tell me. So you see, when Peter was in the boat, he did not forfeit his reason. He just thought differently. He just reasoned it differently. He said, well, okay, I'm not going to walk on water, but if you tell me to walk on water, like you are walking on water, like think about the reasoning. I'm thinking about Peter. I'm thinking, how did it go in his mind? I see Jesus walking on water. First, I'm afraid. Then he tells me it's him. So what am I seeing? Am I seeing from my own eyes that Jesus can walk on water? I'm seeing it in front of me. So it changes my whole way of thinking. So it is possible to walk on water when you're Jesus. It is possible to walk on water when God wants it. Is it possible for me to walk on water if God wants it? That's why he asked the question. You tell me to come and I'll come. You see, Peter's reasoning capacities were not sleeping somewhere. Peter's reasoning capacities were active. And then he just thought differently. Well, if God can walk on water and if he asks me to come, I will walk on water. So let's go back to Abraham and let's try to define the role of faith and reason and how they relate to each other. So there's a few things. I think I made my notes here because I don't have all the verses. Maybe do I? Yes. Okay, so Abraham is about to give his only son. Now, 4 times in scriptures we have not evidence. What's the word? Exhibit. You know how you have like you have a trial, then a court case, and they say Exhibit A, Exhibit B, right? Well, they don't say that, but they have numbers. But the point is, we have 4 exhibits: Exhibit A, B, C, and D, that shows us that Abraham was completely and fully capable of rational thinking when he was offering his son, right? 4 verses in the Bible that shows us that. Number 1, Genesis 22:5, and then Genesis 22:8. Exhibit A, Exhibit B. We have 2, Genesis 22, when he offers his son, we have 2 things that actually are interesting. Number 1, in verse 5, he says to his servants, stay here, we will come back. Not I will come back. He knows he's coming back, right? He's saying to his servants, okay, you guys will stay over here. My son and I will come back. He already knows, right? You hear something? Verse 8, what did he say? Verse 8, Genesis 22. Isaac asked the question, here's the wood, here's the fire, where's the sacrifice? God will provide the sacrifice. He knows. So now stop for a second, because then I have 2 verses in Hebrews. But think of a second. Why did Abraham? Let's think with Abraham for a moment. Like if we assume that Abraham did not do the crazy jump as Kierkegaard said, both of them are 2 sides of the same coin, right? Like I keep my reasoning capacities when I walk by God, with God, because it makes complete sense for me to trust in the future, right? Like if God says, I will love you with an everlasting love in Jeremiah 3:23, for example. What does it mean? It means that the love of God, nothing can separate me from the love of God, Romans 8, right? So what does it mean? That means that I can believe, I have a reason to believe that if God loves me, he will love me for eternity, right? I have a reason to believe this, so it makes sense for me. So I can live a life that is I can live my life in joy and security because I know I'm loved by God. It makes sense for me, right? Well, how can you believe that the love that a God that you don't see loves you? That's part of faith, but it makes complete sense, right? Let's go back to Genesis because I'm digressing here. But let's put ourselves in the place of Abraham and let's think for a moment, right? Okay, so how many sons does Abraham have? He has 2, right? One son of the promise, and he had Ishmael before. Anybody remember the story of Ishmael? God gave him a promise, you'll have a son. He said, sure I will, so I'm gonna make one, right? And Sarah said, yeah, go ahead. You should go ahead and do it. So they has a son, and God comes back years later and says, well, this is not the son. I will come back in a year, you will have a son, and this is the son of the promise, which is through him, and not through him, Ishmael, through this son Isaac, you will have a descendants, and nations will come out of you. Okay, so think this way. So you're Abraham. Okay, so I made a mistake. Okay, I have a son. That's not the one. This is the one. So Abraham is thinking, I'm going to go and take Isaac. I'm going to bring him up at the mountain. I'm going to sacrifice him. And he knows something needs to happen, because it cannot be that this son will die. What does it mean if Isaac is killed? What does it mean? If Isaac is killed, what does it mean? What does Abraham have to believe? Yes.
The Abraham covenant that he will be a father of a great nation would end right
through
then
Isaac,
and there.
not through Ishmael, right? So
yes, through Isaac.
So I'm asking the question this way.
Two.
Huh?
Yeah, the Isaac and then princes from Ishmael.
Right. But I mean, but this Israel is through yes. So the point here is, what does it mean if Isaac dies? What does it mean if Isaac dies? What does it mean?
That God is a total liar. That he basically told him a nice lie. He made him suffer. You made me suffer for all this time.
Yes.
You made me wait for a long time.
Yes.
Just to have my son killed.
Yes.
I mean, what kind of God are you? That's
Yes.
basically the point. Huh?
Yes. So the point is, if Isaac dies, God is a liar. He lied to Abraham. Okay? Well, yeah.
It says someplace, perhaps in the New Testament, that Abraham believed that God could raise Isaac from the dead.
That's the two other exhibits we're talking about. But first, that's Hebrews tell us that. Okay, but the point being is that I'm not saying if he resurrects the dead or not, if Isaac dies, because Abraham is willing to give him a sacrifice, and he's willing to kill him because God stops him when his knife is ready to kill him. So, but what does it mean to believe that he believed that God was capable of raise the dead? What does it mean between Abraham and God? What's the relationship? Right? Exactly, trust. So when he said, I will come back down, whether I kill my son or not, and that's why you got the verse, I'm going to give you the verses in Hebrews, right? Hebrews 11:17 and Hebrews 11:19. It says there that he was the son of the covenant, none other, and he believed that God has the capacity to raise the dead. So at no point Abraham was doing something crazy. He knew who was God. He knew who he was, right? He knew that this was the son of the promise. God never lied to him. So something is going to happen. I'm on my way up. Where's the sacrifice? God will provide a sacrifice. I go, okay, well, you believe that? Okay, I'm going to wait the last minute. And he's ready to kill him. Why did he go all the way through? Because he believed that God had the power to resurrect the dead. Why did he believe that? Because he's ready to kill his son. He's thinking, I'm going to have to kill him because I'm obeying God, but God will have to resurrect him. Not because he likes his son, because otherwise God would be a liar if he didn't. Because God would not accomplish his promise through. Now, when you think this way, when you think of the story of Abraham, does this make sense? No. I think Kierkegaard was completely wrong. I don't think he had any clue of how much trust Abraham had in God. Because if he did, he wouldn't think that faith is the opposite of reason. When I said earlier that faith is another way of reasoning, this is exactly what we see with those 4 verses. Abraham is thinking differently. Well, God is in the picture, so God never lied to me. He wants my son, the son he promised that I would have, and through him I will have descendants and nations. So if he wants me to, maybe he's testing me, maybe he wants to show me that he's capable of raising the dead. I don't know, but it makes complete sense that if God asked me to obey, to give my son, it makes sense for me to do it. I don't know what he's going to do about it, but he's going to do something about it because God never lies. And therefore, so you see, Abraham is thinking about the process. It makes complete sense. And in Genesis, when he says to his servants, yeah, we'll come back. We'll come back. Because he really believes that he will come back with his son. So, many people think that there's a difference between faith and reason, and there is. Reason is limited to our natural capacity to accept what is acceptable to our own brain. Faith is a bigger dimension, is what is God capable of doing despite my human limitations. And that changes everything. But will God, okay, so think about all the miracles you know in the Bible. They don't go against anything, really. It's not like God made, turn a pumpkin and he turned the pumpkin into someone. He doesn't do that, He turns water into wine, yes. He makes the lame whole. He makes the blind see. But he restores people. That's what he does. But the miracles in the Bible, they're impossible for men to do, but they're not inconceivable for men to think if God exists. Yes, it makes complete sense that if I fail and God loves me and that I need to be saved and he's the only one that can save me, it makes complete sense that he would die on the cross for me. It makes complete sense that God dying would have to resurrect, otherwise he wouldn't be God if he did not defeat death. And all of a sudden, the gospel makes complete sense. Everything makes sense, yes. Well, today, for example, we go back to the idea of people not liking the Bible because it contains so many things about sins. But then, it makes sense. I had this conversation with my cousins one day, and he said, well, I understand why you're a Christian, maybe, but why do you go to church? It makes sense to me. Okay, well, you believe, I don't know. And then we're talking about, there's so many things in Christianity that I don't agree about. You guys are against this, you guys are against that. It's true that Christians should be more careful in voicing their opinion because the only thing they hear from Christians is what the Christians don't agree. That's kind of, okay, well, we're against abortion. Yes, we are, but we also, we're also pro something else. It's not that, what I'm saying? It's not like every time we voice our concerns in the society is because we're against. That's kind of annoying. So I get the point, right? But the point here is that in our conversation, I said, well, it's, where was I going with this? Well, anyway, so I'm looking at the time thinking I need to move on. But, okay, the thing we're saying here is faith as presented in the scriptures is not what we believe it is all the time. Faith is substance and evidence. It makes complete sense to me, right? The things hoped for are substantial to me because God said it. The things unseen becomes seen to me because I have faith. And I can see things through hope. I can see things through faith that I couldn't see without it. So faith is not the opposite of reason. Faith, as I said, is a different way of reasoning that includes God in the equation. Go ahead.
God honors people who both do not see and yet other people have to see. Thomas is an example. Mm-hmm. It took Thomas seeing Jesus' scars, mm-hmm. And then he immediately said, my Lord, my God. Mm-hmm. So Paul also used evidence of the 500 plus people mm-hmm. who had seen Christ resurrected, mm-hmm. and how many people saw him actually rise into the sky from the Mount of Olives. Mm-hmm. So God helps our unbelief.
Yes.
And he did that for Abraham, mm-hmm. because Abraham had at least one miracle, and that was Sarah giving birth at the age of, mm-hmm. 90? Mm-hmm. And that was impossible at the time. So
yes.
with God, all things are possible.
Yes.
So when you believe that with God all things are possible, and yet he may say no, then you're okay with that. So if you're waiting for a miracle and that miracle maybe doesn't come when you expect it, you still have this platform that God is capable of performing that miracle, but mm-hmm. he sees beyond that, and he says, go slow, no, he knows best, because mm-hmm. he sees the end from the beginning.
Yes. Yeah, the point we're making also is that, okay, so if you think about, you can think about, we use the word trust several times to define what faith is. We can see that in our relationship with people, right? Maybe a simple example would be, I don't know, maybe there's a friend of mine, maybe it's not a real example, but just making it up, but let's say my best friend ever, like for 30 years, he's one of the best lawyers in DC, okay? And then something comes up. I have a court case that comes up in a month. I don't know what it is. I don't know what to do. I know I'm innocent. I need to find, and the point being is that, and he gives me a call. Hey, I heard about this. I'll be there, on the day of the court. Don't worry about it. I know what to say. I know what to do. You'll be fine. So now I have a choice, right? I have this friend I have for 30 years. He's always came through to me, never lies, always reliable, good lawyer, all these things. So my court case is in 5 weeks, okay, for example, right? Now, the fact that he called me and said he would be there in 5 weeks, does it change the circumstances for me? It doesn't. It's still 5 weeks of waiting. I still have to wait for my court case, and I still have to wait for the judge to make his decision. But does it change something somehow in my mental state? Completely. Now I have a word from my friend, I have a promise, and I know he's capable. So even though the decision hasn't been made, the case is still pending, I'm still 5 weeks away, but my outcome, or my outlook on what's coming is completely different, because I have a word from my friend, and then he's trustworthy. Therefore, my thinking is different. Now, I didn't become careless all of a sudden because I didn't want to think, right? I didn't live in denial. That's why I'm fine. Oh, there's no court case. This is baloney. I'm not. No, this is still here, right? It's still coming, still pending. But because I have this friendship with this capable guy who's going to be able to handle my issue, I'm completely have a different outlook on what's coming. It's the same with God, right? Our faith makes sense because God is giving us a word. Our faith makes sense because God is telling us something. And as you said earlier, we have things happening in our life. We look back just like Abraham did. I was not supposed to have a child. I had one. Completely impossible. Okay, God never lied to me. He did amazing things in my life. So I know which God I'm serving, and therefore it makes complete sense, and we use the word complete sense, he's in my reasoning to believe in him. And I have to add faith in what I believe, of course, because I have to make a decision that it's going to be okay for me to go up the mountain, Moraja, and accept to sacrifice him because he said so. So I still have to make a decision, but my decision is not against my reason. It's a different way of reasoning. And why is this important in apologetics? Because people think that faith is the opposite of reason, and many times we believe as Christians it's the same. And it is not at all, okay? So I'm seeing the time, so I'm thinking normally we take a break, but I'm gonna go. If that's okay with you, Pastor Zeke, I'll just go. Okay, super. All right, so again, remember we're wrapping up tonight is when we develop a method or a philosophy apologetic. We're trying to include all these things and say, okay, what does it mean? So we said, talking about the psychology of the unbeliever, Romans 1:18, we said it several times. They know the truth, but they suppress it. So that means that if I let them be the judge of all the evidence I'm piling up in front of them, I'm not challenging their belief system. Right? If someone is a rationalist, if somebody is a materialist, I will challenge his worldview by saying, no, materialism, as Chesterton said, gradually destroys humanity. Like you are destroying humanity by believing man is only matter and energy. So you cannot account for the totality of human experience if you don't believe there is more than matter and energy. It's easy for me to say that, but rationalism is something that I usually don't challenge as a Christian, because I'm afraid I'm going to sound irrational. But we are challenging rationalism. We are not challenging reason. Okay? That's the difference is here. What I'm saying here is that, and that's why this is very important. The way we go about doing apologetics will show whether or not we are challenging rationalism or not. If I meet you in the street and you tell me, well, I'm a scientist, give me some proof. Remember what we said about 1 Corinthians 1, chapter 1, and verse 23? Greek want miracles, and the Jews, the Jews want miracles, signs, and the Greeks want wisdom. And what did Paul said? But we preach Christ. I remember what he said. We don't give them miracles. We don't give them wisdom. We preach Christ. So we are challenging rationalism by saying you believe that you are setting the standard. Okay. Like for example, if like Bertrand Russell, when he was asked one day, he was a famous atheist philosopher, and he was asked by a journalist one day, and the journalist says, okay, if you die and God does exist, what would you tell him? And he said, well, God did not give me enough proof. That's what I would tell him. So he's happy about his answer. And the point being is, I think for me, this is exactly what we're talking about, is any proof that he heard, because he heard a lot of proofs, because Bertrand Russell used to argue and debate with a lot of great apologists and thinkers of his time. So he heard it all. But he was never challenged in his rationalism, just like David Hume was never challenged in his empiricism. These guys were not challenged in their philosophy, therefore they are like this, almost like I'm going to go over here, I'm going on top. Okay, now you can talk to me. I'm going to stand straight. Okay, bring the evidence. And I'm going to decide whether or not I like your evidence or not. But then you could ask me, what are you doing on the stage? Why do you think you're allowed to use your reason as the ultimate authority? And you could ask the question, for example. I do that sometimes. That's one way that I challenge rationalism. I have this quote here that I brought for you, and I will give you some of the quotes because I printed a few copies. But listen to this. This is what C.S. Lewis said in his book, Mere Christianity, right? So I'm going to give it out because with my French accent, I'm going to destroy the quote. So you have. Can you hand it out? You have one, yes. Miranda doesn't. So it's the last one at the bottom. It's the big paragraph. It's the big paragraph at the bottom. Okay. So once everybody have it, we're going to I'm waiting for Pastor Zeke at the end. Okay, so you see, you have a few. We'll go through those tonight, but look at the last one by C.S. Lewis, okay? Supposing there was no intelligence behind the universe, so that's atheism, right? No creative mind. In that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. It is merely that when the atoms inside my skull happen for physical or chemical reasons to arrange themselves in a certain way that gives me as a byproduct the sensation I call thought. All right? Well, he's arguing for the fact that nobody designed your brain. Your thoughts are an accident. Okay? That's plain English. But if so, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? It's like upsetting a milk jug and hoping that the way it splashes itself will give you a map of London. The odds are for your brain to be thinking properly without being designed are the same as you taking milk, pouring it on the floor, and giving a map of DC. Okay, in one try. It's impossible. But if I can't trust my own thinking, of course, I cannot trust the arguments leading to atheism, and therefore have no reason to be an atheist or anything else. Unless I believe in God, I cannot believe in thought. So I can never use thought to disbelieve in God. That was one of his most interesting discoveries that brought him to become a Christian, because all of his arguments against God or for atheisms presupposed that God existed. Because for him to be able to think properly and think that his brain can work in a reliable way, it had to be designed. Otherwise, he couldn't trust it. So you see, this is why we go back to the method of evangelism. This is why we have to challenge rationalism, because someone who believes in evolution and is a rationalist, it does not make any sense. You're telling me that the ultimate authority for knowing anything is your brain that hasn't been designed to think. That's what you're telling me right now. Okay? How can you be an evolutionist and a rationalist at the same time? It cannot work. That's the point that C.S. Lewis is saying. It is impossible for you and I to believe that we have not been created to think, that in the same time to think that our thinking is reliable. So let's discuss for this for a moment, because I want you to see why rationalism cannot be accepted in a conversation and why anyone who does not believe in God shouldn't be a rationalist. Then they can use their brain, and I know I can believe as a Christian that my brain is reliable, mainly because it was designed to think. So just like anything else that is designed to think or designed to do anything, when it has a purpose, it actually accomplishes the purpose. So we believe as Christians that our reasoning capacities are reliable. But if you don't believe in God, you cannot think this way. And that's the point. So William Ramsay, he's a famous philosopher, Canadian philosopher, and also a biologist. He tried to explain this from his viewpoint. He's an evolutionary biologist, and he's very strongly active in the scientific community to prove that evolution is true philosophically. So he's saying, well, wait a minute. And I think the example he gave one day was, let's think like if you're in nature, you don't know the difference between a cat and a tiger, you won't be there for long, right? Basically, so your thinking capacities are required to work, because if you don't make the difference between a cat and a tiger, then you will approach a tiger, you'll be dead before you can say anything. Okay, so his viewpoint is our reason is necessary for survival. That's the argument. Okay, so think about this way, right? So first is then in a conversation that I had with because I anyways, forget the context, it does not matter. But I had someone used that argument one day, and said because he read the same book and as well, I agree with William Ramsay, so we're talking about this, and he says, well, it's like we need it. And I asked him a few questions. So number one is why out of millions, let's put it a conservative number, why out of millions of species on the planet, why are we the only one having such developed cognitive capacities, right? That would be one question I ask him. And he said, well, because we need to survive. And I argue that we don't, because if we're the only one that is equipped with such a great thinking capacity, why are the other species surviving, right? We supposedly evolved from apes. Apes are still around, right? We have, I think, the population of apes, chimpanzees actually, I think it's 250,000, and they are thriving. They're doing great. They're not extinct. So why did we evolve if we couldn't survive? They don't have cognitive capacities, right? They don't. They survive in the nature better than we do. We are intelligent, so we are using our technology to protect ourselves from the nature in which we're supposed to be thriving because we evolved from it. So it doesn't make any sense either. So I'm asking all these questions in the conversation. And the thing is, and then I ask him a question, why do you think I believe in God? I ask him a question, right? Well, he says, well, because it helps you survive. But I said, do you believe in God? He said, no, of course not. I don't believe in God. So is my mind tricking me in believing that there is a God? And then I think he saw it coming. So he started thinking about, and I said, well, because if my brain, I'm asking you the question, is our brain reliable if God didn't design the brain? He says, yes, it is. And I said, but if my brain is tricking me in believing that there's a God and there's none, so my mind is not reliable, right? Because my brain is tricking me in believing that there is a God for my survival. So could it be, and I asked him the question, could it be that if evolution is true, that our brain are not capable of thinking properly, they are not doing what is best for the survival of our species? It means that truth becomes irrelevant because now we cannot know the truth, because whatever we believe to be true is not true at all. It's just useful for our survival. And then he saw the point, and we went on this conversation, that however you approach the idea of evolution, your mind cannot be reliable, and you are only to presuppose that your mind is reliable for you to be able to think, right? So I know it's kind of a convoluted argument here, but you see the point. Why is rationalism something we cannot accept as Christians, and why no one who is an atheist should be able to claim to be a rationalist? Because the only way to be a rationalist in thinking your brain is always reliable, and to do that you have to believe it has been designed to think. That is the very thing that brought C.S. Lewis to Christ. Okay, so what is the point we're making here? In a way complicated, but in a way simple as well. If I don't use the gospel in preaching when I do apologetics, and I'm only piling up evidence, I'm submitting under the idea that rationalism is a valid way of thinking. Like, I'm going to let you guys decide whether or not, as the ultimate authority for knowing, your brain is capable of deciding whether my arguments are correct. I cannot do that. I cannot afford to do this in an apologetic encounter. I cannot do that. What I need to do is bring the gospel, answer questions, and move on with the gospel. That's what I want to do, because I do not want to validate the idea that rationalism is is an acceptable way of thinking, because it is not. Again, what is rationalism? Rationalism is the idea that our brains, our cognitive capacities, are the ultimate authority in knowing anything and accepting anything. And that is not possible unless our brain was designed to think. You see what the problem is here is that with evidentialist approach, which is the one we were saying earlier the class, if I'm only using evidence, I'm validating an idea that is anti-biblical, which is men do not suppress the truth, so they are completely neutral. The neutrality of the mind is another issue. We have two issues with rationalism, right? One is the reliability of the mind. If God did not create it, it's impossible. And number two, the neutrality of the mind. Like, people don't have any presuppositions. Have you ever met someone that listens to arguments completely open-minded? I've never met one person. Everybody has an extra grind. Everybody has a presupposition. Everybody has something to say. And if you are not careful when you use apologetics, you might actually make that sentiment stronger, because if you're good in doing apologetics, you may put them in the place where they have to question their beliefs in front of you, and nobody feels comfortable doing that. But if I give people room with a message that is powerful enough for them to be convicted, then it's okay. If they change their minds because they have to be confronting the Holy Spirit, which they can be humble before, but they won't be humble before me, because people don't want to do that. Have you ever seen someone who is willing to accept defeat in an argument? Right? That would be the end of divorce. It doesn't happen. People have issues with that. If you come to me and show me that I'm wrong, I will have to be extremely humble to accept the defeat, which I'm not. People are not. I'm not humble. The very nature of human being is pride. So if it's true, so the whole point we made so far, and I think I said it enough times during the last few weeks for you to know what I'm saying, is if we conclude this, we're going to be very simple. Okay, what is the role of faith? What is the role of reason? And what is the role of evidence and apologetics? Very simple. I would like to finish with this and then open for questions. Okay? So, faith and reason work together in apologetics. I can use my arguments. I can argue. You were saying earlier, reasoning is using logic completely. When we will do later on in the semester, I don't know. I don't remember exactly what the next assignments I have. But if we do use arguments for the existence of God, they're very much based on philosophy, right? They're very logical. They use very 3 points argument, premises 1, premise 2, and then you have infer from that, you have a conclusion. So if you've done any logic, you will find yourself using your reasoning capacities. Now, the only thing I have to do is that even though my reason has all its place in my faith, my rationalism doesn't have any place in my faith. Because rationalism would say, we make Abraham say to God, nope, I'm going to go with Kierkegaard on this one. I know my limits. What you're asking me is a big no-no. I'm not doing this. Moving on, right? And that would be a show of us thinking that we know better than God. And I cannot be in that position as a Christian. I can't be in that position as an evangelist, and I cannot be in that position as an apologist, okay? So it goes beyond my reason, but it makes sense to me because God is in the picture. So what is impossible to men is possible to God. That would be another way of bridging the both, right? When I step in faith, what am I doing? I go beyond my doubt. Pastor Schaller said recently, it was very interesting, we had a conversation and he said, well, for him, faith and doubt are two sides of the same coin. It's a very interesting idea, right? Why? Because when do we step in faith? When do we have to step in faith? Tell me. When we doubt. Would we need faith if we didn't doubt? No, we wouldn't. I don't believe so. I don't know. What do you think, Pastor Zeke? Yeah. So the point being really is very, very simple, right? Okay. So this is where I am, and that's the end of my. And God is asking me to follow Him. I don't know how God called you into ministry, but if it was a challenge for you, Pastor Zeke, maybe, or because I don't know what your family background is, or in one way. But for some of us, I come from a business background in one way. So I worked for High. It's still existing here in Washington. I used to live in France. I commute work in Washington with an NGO here in Virginia called Advocates International. It's based on advocacy for human rights and religious freedom worldwide. And if you look it up, there's 1996, 1998. There was a law passed in America under Bill Clinton that's called the International Religious Freedom Act. That was my job to lobby for it. So I went to the Senate. I went to okay, in one way. So it's a very good job, doing all these things. And then God calls you to ministry, and you look at this career over here, and look at God's calling, and thinking, well, I don't know about that. You would make I would make in 1 month what I would make in a year if I enter into ministry. So it doesn't make any sense, right? You want to build your life. I was 25, 26 at the time. I'm going. I'm not a lawyer, but I was an advocate, which is different. So I would have gone to law schools maybe and just him thinking work here, and I moved here then when I was 28 or something, which I didn't. I moved here when I was 42. But the point here is, so is it reasonable for me to make a decision like this? It is not in one way, but it is if God calls me. If God says, I'm going to call you to ministry, and I'm going to provide for you. Okay? Right? Pastor Zeke, you want to say something?
Well, yeah, I was just going to mention that. So the reason I like the faith-doubt, two sides of the coin analogy so much is because once something is established as true, it doesn't take faith anymore. Like I don't need faith in gravity. I've seen gravity demonstrated. I know if I fall out a window, I'm going to fall to the ground. That's not a matter of faith. For me, gravity is a fact. So I no longer need faith. So we can debate, was Jesus real with people? But when Jesus returns, our faith will be sight.
Yes.
So we'll no longer need faith. It will be established as fact.
Yes.
So that's why I appreciate the analogy. Yeah. Yes, faith is moving beyond doubt.
Yes.
And eventually our faith will become sight.
Yes, because, the ideas we're saying is that, because I want to say it this way, stepping in faith is an act of intelligence, which includes things that people don't believe. That's why they think it's crazy. If I'm over here, I'm going to step out of my job and I'm going to enter into ministry. If I would tell you what happens in my family, that my dad, everybody's crazy. Are you nuts? This is not, no. What are you doing? And my grandmother, I remember, she went to all my friends, when they were, hey, how's Philip doing? I haven't seen them in a while. Well, he wants to become a pastor or something. I don't know. Why he's crazy? Why? He's, this is fun. He hops on the plane all the time, having a good. So, and then, but for them it doesn't make any sense. But they don't have the. They don't have the faith that makes it rational. It makes complete sense. And I look back, and actually it's interesting as a testimony. It was 24 years ago. And it's funny how years after, so you go back. So I'm not going to give you all details because I think family is also personal. But the funniest thing is that, how people, in finance you say don't put all your eggs in the same basket. Have this idea. So people tell you that, are you crazy? You're going to go with it? And they don't put their all eggs in the same basket. But what do we have here? The majority of my family, cousins and siblings, are divorced. The majority of them lost their house in a divorce, right? Something happened, the children are talking to them. And 24 years later, my wife and I, who made faith decisions, the crazy kind, like Soren Kierkegaard, that you shouldn't make. And for us, it was completely, so the only one, last week I bought a house in France, okay? Don't tell me how I did it, I don't know. But because my mom needed a place to live, and I was the only child in the family that was capable of doing it. I don't know how. But I shouldn't be able to do this because everybody's working. They're working, they have jobs, and the point is, and just God being God. Okay, you follow me, I'll take care of you. So that's why when we walk in faith, people don't understand because they don't see God in the picture. But for me, it makes total sense. Yes, I'm giving I'm giving my tithes, I'm giving an offering, I'm supporting missionaries, whatever I do, it makes complete sense to me because God provides. So our faith, when we explain our faith, it's completely reasonable in the good, I want to say in the good sense of the term. It makes complete sense for us to do what we do. We're not nuts. We didn't lose our brain. We lose our mind completely. No, we didn't. We just think differently. We think on a higher level, if you want to say. And that's why, and when we understand that, then rationalism becomes the bottom line. It's just over here. It's just, this is nothing. This is rationalism is a limited way of thinking, and if we don't challenge that, then people won't be able to see what the gospel means. And if I don't challenge that by showing the gospel to be true, by actually preaching it and using the power of the word, then I'm limiting the idea because I won't be actually challenging someone who thinks on a rational level only. You want to say something else? No? Okay. So a few more minutes and we'll be done. So look at some of the quotes over here. The first one by Peter Kreeft. Peter Kreeft used to be a professor of philosophy. He's a Catholic. I think Boston College is a Catholic university. But this is what he says: we cannot avoid reasoning. We can only avoid doing it well. And that's the reason why. And he's a Christian apologist, right? He's a Catholic apologist. He was a Christian apologist, just like Chesterton. And the point being is that, for me, rationalism is not reasoning well. Because rationalism is a closed-minded idea that there cannot be anything beyond my own capacity to think. Like the other day, my wife and I, we went for a hike, in PA. And then, so we're walking and we walk for an hour and a half one way, we go an hour and a half the other way. And at the end, we were talking, we're looking at the thing, and then the whole thing is like, at the end, let's turn around. And my wife and I, she said something to me, I agree with her. Wow, now we're going to go back down, right? Because then we went up the whole time. And we're walking and thinking, we see like maybe a quarter mile up, it's going up. That's weird. We went up the whole time. Oh, maybe we didn't see at the end, maybe. But you know what? The whole time back was up. And how is that possible that we're walking, thought we were going up, and we come back, we're going up on the same road? We went up one way and came back the same way. And we look at this. We had to go back for a quarter mile and think, our perception was completely misguided by the tree line, all these things. You think you're going down, but you're going up. You think you're going up, but you're going down. Our perception of our life, like our distance perceptions, what we perceive in our relationship, what we hear from people sometimes, that's why we have problem with communications, is wrong. So our brains are not reliable in the way, so unless you believe that God created your mind to be able to think properly, and like now, when I use that example and realize my perception is not good, my brain is capable, I have to think about it, my brain is capable of thinking. And the point here is that, what we said earlier, I think it was a couple of classes ago, like you cannot be a materialist and a humanist at the same time, and you cannot be an evolutionist and a rationalist at the same time. It is impossible. For you to believe that reason is the ultimate authority, you will have to believe in God, because you will have to believe your reason is absolutely capable of thinking, and it's reliable. So we cannot avoid doing reasoning, but we can absolutely avoid doing it well. Yes?
Are you saying that the person basically believes he's God because
Yes.
he has the correct reasoning?
Absolutely. That's what people think. The people tell you, okay, they come to you, and if I would come to you and I would ask you for proofs, what I'm actually assuming is that you're going to give me some proof, and the underlying understanding that I'm not telling you is that I will be the judge of that. I will be the judge of everything you say, because that makes sense to me. But you cannot allow that, because we actually giving them a false sense of security in thinking they can get away with not believing what they're being told. So they can suppress the truth, as Romans 1:18. And by being an evidentialist, I'm fueling the idea that suppressing the truth is something you can do without any consequences. And I cannot afford that as a Christian. Right?
Yeah. In that chapter 5, sort of the last paragraphs had the idea that the Western mind conceives of God as being absolute love.
Yes.
And yet they assume that other religions also believe that. But when you look at it, it's not true. And so the idea of love factors out the idea of judgment. And so you say, well, love trumps all, and even judgment. And some people phrase that as mercy over, over judgment or so. Mm-hmm. But that's God's decision, and God shows himself as not being single-minded. It says God is love, but also God is judge.
Yes.
And so you wonder, the person that believes God is only judge is basically believing that he's God, because he has set those parameters. I believe that God is absolute love, and love doesn't contradict his judgment, so therefore he's not a judge or something like that.
Okay. One more quote before we finish, and then I'm going to leave you at that. So if you look at the one before last by J.K. Chesterton, it says, "Reason is itself a matter of faith. It is an act of faith to assert that my thoughts have any relation to reality at all." That's another way of arguing against rationalism. If you don't believe your brain has been designed to think, then you have to believe by faith what you observe is true. It's one of the conversations I had. I think I told you about this. With my family, have several, people that are in the field of science, and like when they say science is the only way to know, it's what you would actually call scientism. It's a philosophy more than an approach. And I asked my cousin one day, so how do you prove that scientifically? If science is the only way to know, how do you prove that sentence scientifically? Right? It's very simple questions. If science is the only way to know, and you know that science is the only way to know, how did you come to that conclusion scientifically? You can't. It's a presupposition, right? It's the same way here. Like, for me to be able to assert that what I observe as a scientist has any connection to reality is a matter of faith, unless I believe that my brain has been designed to think it, therefore it's reliable. So rationalism is not an acceptable philosophy, period. But it's certainly not an acceptable philosophy when it comes down to an apologetic encounter. I need to make that very clear, and I need to be able to challenge that in my conversations. Okay, that is why this is very important. All right. So thank you very much. I think are you doing the class next week or? Yes. Okay, super. And then I think I'm coming back for a couple more weeks, and that's it. So there we go.
All right. Thanks, Philippe. I'd like to do a little informal Q&A with him. If we could, in the kitchen. So those of you watching online, we're going to shut down formally. Just remember, you've got to do your midterm exam. It is due at the beginning of next Monday's class. You can certainly submit it online, that kind of stuff too, but it is due at the beginning of class next Monday. And the one we gave you in class has an extra credit question, and I don't think we've posted the extra credit question online yet. So if you're watching online and you're going to pull that down, you'll want to check back, because I need to update it with the extra credit question on there. Okay, so those of you here in the room, I would like us to move to an informal Q&A to the kitchen. We have some food in there that we want you to participate in. And then I have a question for Philippe, and we'll do that Q&A there. Sound good? All right.